Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. Before I kick it over to Debbie Hamill, IAOP CEO, I did want to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and the slides and recording will be available in about 24 hours. We'll send that to you directly. Debbie, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Amanda. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today's webinar on strategic supply chain restructuring is brought to you by IAOP corporate member Baker McKenzie. It's through the support of our corporate member companies that we are able to bring you programs like these to make your jobs a little easier and help get you through what continues to be a difficult time. And as we continue to maneuver through the challenges of this pandemic, we are faced with the profound impact COVID-19 has had on supply chains. During today's program, Sam Kramer and Amy Barber will take us through how applying lessons learned from this pandemic is the key to making supply chains resilient. And to get us started, please allow me to introduce Sam Kramer, partner, Baker McKenzie. Sam, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Debbie. My name is Sam Kramer. I'm a partner in the IP Tech practice group at Baker McKenzie in our Chicago offices. For those of you who aren't familiar with Baker and McKenzie, we're a large global law firm. And one of the great things about working at Baker and McKenzie is working with colleagues around the world to help our clients solve problems, particularly problems that have a global impact. And in having practiced for over 25 years at Baker, I really haven't seen anything like this pandemic and the challenge that it's presenting to businesses on a global level, particularly in the supply chain area. So I want to thank Debbie and Amanda and IAOP for having us today and our ability to speak to you about the framework that we've created for strategic supply chain restructuring in light of the pandemic. I and my colleague Amy Barber will be speaking to you over the next hour or so on the framework and the issues that we've come up with in terms of how to look at or reevaluate your supply chain in light of the pandemic. Should you have questions for us during our presentation, I think there's a chat box that's available that you can put your questions into, and we'll try and address as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. For those that we don't get to, if we have your email addresses, we'll try and respond to you after the program. So Amy, could you go to the next slide, please? Great. Thanks so much. So the initial set of questions that we started to get from our clients with respect to supply chain issues once the pandemic was starting to hit towards the middle of the spring of this year were the type of questions regarding an immediate impact. How do we keep the lights on type of questions? And addressing the immediate impact of the pandemic on the supply chain tended to raise the same types of questions. Clients would ask us, are we protected under our contracts or not? Is this a force majeure event or not? Can we have a defense for non-performance? Does our supplier have a defense for non-performance? What are the rights under our contract? What notices do we have to give? All of the types of things that you look at in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. And a lot of these had to do with travel restrictions that were beginning to be imposed, a lot of questions about conferences and agreements with respect to hotel and hospitality companies and what the parties' obligations were there as we started to see travel restrictions and stay-at-home orders that were rolling kind of across the globe. From the spring and into the summer, those types of questions started to change a little bit, and we started to have more questions regarding reopening. We want to get people back to work. How do we do it safely? How do we make sure that our suppliers are getting back to work safely? And after reopening, we move into the third stage, which is really what we're talking about now with a lot of our clients, which are questions around resiliency. So how does the pandemic affect the supply chain, and how should we consider the pandemic with respect to its impact on the supply chain for what may be the foreseeable future? So the way we approached this particular problem, and it was an interesting challenge, was really to go back to Supply Chain 101 and think about the entirety of the supply chain and the different component parts of the supply chain lifecycle. Then we very practically applied, the impact of the pandemic to come up with a model to evaluate its impact on each step of the supply chain. In doing that, we recognize that our clients are challenged by a lot of different factors, including things like cost reduction, which has always been a big focus of the supply chain. And we know that we needed to focus on cost reduction issues as well, but we've been finding that there are also opportunities for value creation, especially on the risk management, risk identification, and risk mitigation side. Because we have a global platform, we looked across the globe and tried to understand how the pandemic was affecting the world. It may affect the entire world, but the impact happens at different stages and in different jurisdictions at different times. And there are different government approaches that have an impact on how the pandemic is going to affect the supply chain. So we started to look at that kind of in our offices with our practitioners around the world in order to be able to advise our clients on what we were seeing locally to help them act in a global manner. So in speaking with our clients, and many of them are and sit in the supply chain as both a buyer and a supplier, they had to look at the pandemic from really both perspectives. And so essentially the framework that we've created is really one for a discussion to happen between buyers and suppliers as to what the new normal is or is going to be, and to relook at supply chains in the light of something unanticipated like this pandemic. And it brought us back to some earlier principles with respect to the approach to risk, and what that strategy is and what we've learned from the past. And we're applying that here as we look at risk mitigation strategies. How can you collaborate to remove risk from the supply chain in a way that doesn't impose material cost on one party or another that's not being paid for? So it's not just an issue of trying to leverage or shift risk, pushing that ball from one party to another, but really to have an appreciation of what this risk is and how to address it. And costs can be addressed in a couple of ways that are important to think about as we step through the slides. One of them can be remuneration. Prices can increase for additional protection against risk. And another way is to look at contractual relief. There may be things in your supply chain agreements, that could be valuable to the other side, such as, relief from service level requirements or other requirements that were drafted thinking about parties actually being physically present with one another. So those are some of the things that we started to look at. And the slide that we have up now kind of shows you the framework that we looked at in terms of breaking down supply chain into these different life cycle steps. And as we looked at each of those, we tried to come up with, well, what were the key considerations with respect to each of these stages in the supply chain? It forces, the pandemic has forced enterprises to go back and reevaluate risks associated with particular sourcing decisions that they've already made, and to think of them from the perspective of knowing, what we know today about the global pandemic, although obviously that seems to change on a daily or weekly basis. So the first part, of the life cycle focuses on supplier identification, supplier qualification, really diligence issues around certain questions that you ask in creating your supply chain. And one of those questions may be, is this the type of service? Are these the type of tasks that should be handed to a third party, that should be outsourced to a third party? Or are they the kinds of things that, in light of the risks posed by the pandemic, should be retained within the four walls of the organization itself? Then we go on to look at questions of, review, supplier review, and supplier selection. And this is really probably the most interesting part from an attorney's perspective, because we spend a lot of time drafting and negotiating supply chain contracts. And what we wanted to do, and what was the jumping off point for this entire exercise, was to think about the contractual protections that we need to be evaluating, modifying, changing, or adding to address some of the supply chain pandemic risks. And we've worked to come up with, playbooks for addressing supply chain contract risks and model clauses that can be used. And Amy's going to take a deeper dive into some of those issues a little bit later in our discussion. The onboarding process, how do you onboard a supplier when you can't have them physically come to your premises? How does that impact the supply chain, and what risks does it introduce? Then there's the performance management aspect of the supply chain. Is there an impact here, that nobody could really foresee? How do we manage that? What kind of relief should there be? Relief from service levels, potentially. What's the right way to address performance management when something unexpected arises? And which party is really best equipped to handle managing those particular risks? Risk management, as you've heard me mention it already, really permeates this whole discussion. And we'll be thinking about and talking about risk management in the supplier relationship and managing your suppliers. We expect to spend kind of most of our time in our discussion today on the aspect of supplier review and selection, the contracting phase and negotiating phase, where risk is really talked about and addressed. But each step is important in thinking about how the pandemic is affecting the supply chain. We're also very interested in learning more about this topic. Every time we talk about this topic, we give a presentation, we get great feedback from the participants about their own anecdotes and best practices, which we very much appreciate. So looking forward to any of the suggestions, questions, challenges, etc., that you may have as we step through this. Amy, can you go to the next slide, please? Great. So as we noted, supplier identification is the first step in the life cycle in our wheel that we have here. And what the pandemic highlights is really the need for the reevaluation of sourcing risks, even down to the level of whether or not a particular good or service should be sourced to a third party. We've had the opportunity to present this framework, something like it a number of times, including to groups of financial institutions. And in particular, these types of risks really do require a reevaluation, because if there's a critical service that's being sourced and that source all of a sudden cannot continue to satisfy the requirements of the contract, the requirements of regulation because of a pandemic, it really changes the risk profile of that particular good or service being sourced. And that's acutely felt in the regulated sourcing space, where you are operating in financial services industries and healthcare industries, et cetera. In terms of working with these kind of regulated entities in the sourcing project, it was really interesting to see that a number of the regulators had already started to consider a number of these issues really before we ever knew about COVID-19 and the pandemic. I happen to co-chair Baker and McKenzie's fintech practice. I'm the lead in the North American offices. And in looking at financial industry regulators, we saw that resiliency and reacting to external risk, particularly it's external risks that can't be fully predicted or their outcomes fully known, was something that the regulators did coming out of the global financial downturn. And when we look at some of the guidance from, for example, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the Fed, their equivalents in other jurisdictions, they had a kind of approach to looking at the supply chain holistically as a triangle. So essentially, the first leg of that triangle is this supplier identification. It's the due diligence exercise. And as mentioned, should this good or service be sourced outside of the organization itself? The kind of build buy decision that you have at the beginning. And when you start to see vulnerabilities from something like a financial downturn or a pandemic, it makes you reassess whether the decision that you made to go to a third party is still a valid risk decision, depending on how critical it might be. So we saw a kind of synergy with what some of those regulators had done coming out of the global financial downturn to the types of things that sourcing managers need to do in light of the pandemic. The second leg of the triangle that these regulators focused on, again, is going to be the area that we concentrate on, the contract provisions that are meant to protect the party that's seeking to have goods or services sourced. And that is something that the regulators in the regulated sourcing space did focus on. And the third part, which is critical to our discussions, the third leg of that triangle that was identified is ongoing management. So that's what we're doing now really for existing supply chain relationships, is looking at the ongoing management of that relationship and the reassessment that may need to occur in light of external circumstances, such as a pandemic. In the financial institution space, the regulators require that those institutions constantly monitor and reevaluate risk in light of current circumstances. And that's in guidance that goes all the way back to 2013. And it's good guidance, I think, for sourcing managers generally. How are we going to reassess risk in light of the pandemic? We had touched on a few of those issues in terms of supply chain interruptions. One that we can't forget about really is the economic impact of this pandemic and what that impact may be on your supply chain partners. We only have to look at the hospitality industry, the travel industry to see the enormous impact that's being experienced. And in the retail industry, we're reading of bankruptcies of well-known names that are going to require all parties to reevaluate the risk profile of their supply chain partners. Regional diversification is one of the things that supply chain managers are looking at and how that might help mitigate risks with respect to something like a pandemic. Assessing risks with respect to import and export restrictions, especially if there are restrictions on whether ships can dock in particular ports and how that can affect risk in the supply chain. Immigration is also another area that's being impacted as well, and will have an impact on suppliers and the movement of people. With respect to supplier qualification, kind of the next step with respect to evaluating the topics in the supply chain, once you've made it through the decision of whether to source a particular product or service with a third party, then you need to look at who your suppliers are and who you might want to work with, really under a framework that we're calling Know Your Supplier, which again, we borrowed from the financial services space that have regulations relating to Know Your Customer. So with respect to supplier qualification and how it's impacted by the pandemic, what a lot of this boils down to is understanding what your supplier's approach to risk is. And at Baker and McKenzie, we're not immune to this, as we're suppliers to our clients, and they want to see what our approach is to pandemic risk management. So understanding the supplier's approach to pandemic risk management is going to be key in evaluating the resiliency of your supply chain. One question that we get from, in particular, suppliers who are our clients, ask us whether we think the response to the pandemic is going to be a differentiator in the marketplace. Will suppliers who have well thought through pandemic readiness policies be more successful than those that don't? And in thinking about this, we believe that that has to be the case, that this is the opportunity that's come as a result of the pandemic threat. And in terms of the type of due diligence that a well-managed company will enter into when looking at particular suppliers, they're going to look at pandemic readiness. We've already seen some of the more material managed service agreements, even before the pandemic, addressing some of these issues in their business continuity plans. And that may have been the result of the SARS outbreak in the Far East, which affected that region in a very serious way and interrupted the supply of labor in certain outsourced relationships. And a number of supply chain agreements started to contemplate how to address the impact of those types of restrictions on supplier obligations to provide and customers' right to receive certain managed services. And that gets into the whole issue of work from home. When you have work from home already set up in your business continuity plan, it's understanding who are going to provide the laptops that the associates are going to use. What are the security requirements and privacy issues when someone is working from home? And to the extent these get thought out, these are the type of questions that sourcing managers are going to start to ask. What's your resiliency plan in the event of disruptions, like the pandemic, but not only the pandemic? Other ones that we know are going to be coming, but we don't know exactly what they are or what their impact are going to be. Having thought through some of these issues already and having applied them in light of the global financial downturn and light of the pandemic, we'll be able to see really battle-tested pandemic response strategies that really can be differentiators in the marketplace. Amy, next slide, please.
Perfect.
So here we get to review and
Sorry,
selection.
Sam, go ahead.
Yes, and I was just going to hand it over to you. This is the deeper dive, really, that we talked about and the things that lawyers focus on when it comes to reevaluating their supply chain in light of the pandemic. So, Amy, please go ahead and take it forward.
Perfect. So with respect to supplier review and selection, we really think this kind of incorporates everything from RFPs to proposal review, travel restrictions, virtual negotiations, as well as contract terms, which really for us is kind of the bread and butter driver for this presentation. So what we think is really interesting is kind of thinking about supply chain contracts themselves. So as Sam has mentioned throughout, initially we were getting a lot of questions from clients about their force majeure clauses. And what became really evident early on was that until you have a pandemic like this one or another kind of disruptive event, the force majeure clause isn't a provision in the contract that gets much attention. Parties might review it, they might check a box to ensure they've included it, but whether a particular force majeure provision covers a pandemic risk may not have been something that the parties were thinking about at the time of contracting. So for instance, really important pieces of a force majeure provision, like what are the necessary triggers to enforce it, or to enact your force majeure defense, or what kind of notice do you have to give, what are the risks that you waive that defense if you fail to notify the counterparty. Some real material pieces that would have an impact with respect to a force majeure clause were just not things that were kind of top of mind for parties. So as we were getting these questions around force majeure, we kind of started to think about, well, what are other clauses in a contract that would be worth kind of giving a think to and kind of analyzing whether there are certain edits or changes that you could include into those provisions in order to sort of mitigate future risk of pandemics or other disruptive events. As a kind of continuation, what we've got here, we prepared an inventory of contractual provisions that we identified as being potentially impacted by pandemics. We provide IT commercial contracting support to a lot of clients, including kind of assisting in the preparation and negotiation of different supplier and distribution agreements. And other IT agreements, and often in-house legal will share with us kind of their preferred model clauses or contracting playbooks. Already we've seen clients express a real interest in kind of dusting off their template terms and taking a fresh look and giving kind of some thought to how they would like to approach contracting, both in their role as a supplier and in their role as a customer. As Sam mentioned earlier on in the presentation, most, if not all, of our clients really do are kind of postured in both positions, where oftentimes they're acting in the capacity of a supplier, other times as a customer, and it really matters when you're thinking about how you like to kind of architect your contracts in order to consider the risks from both of those perspectives. So this really goes to the point of kind of conducting that bifurcated evaluation of standard terms. So as we kind of walk through some of these, it is really kind of a key threshold level consideration to think, what are the types of interests that we're trying to protect if we're a customer, and what are the things that are really important if we're acting in the role of a supplier. So we'll kind of touch on some of those. I think force majeure, again, is a really big one. We've kind of fleshed it out a bit here. I think a really interesting provision that after we got force majeure questions, people started to kind of ask about was additional insurance coverages. So one of, if not the major issue from an insurance perspective, is that events that result in correlated losses like a global pandemic, meaning just insurance companies don't have a way to spread those risks, result in insurance companies excluding losses related to this type of impact, or often excluding those. And really the kind of bargaining around that is, because those risks can't be spread, the prepay for those insurance premiums kind of start to look like a bit of a prepay because the amounts are so high for those policies. Very few parties found that they had coverage against the pandemic. I think looking at insurance is kind of the last opportunity to address risk that you haven't been able to mitigate or allocate. It's something to kind of dive into with insurance brokers if parties are interested. We think from kind of a legal contracting perspective that there are some provisions that really are a bit more flexible in terms of adding in additional coverage for parties. One of the early ones that we kind of talked about was audit rights. And we think with respect to audit rights, there really is a lot of opportunity for innovation. One of the interesting things really about audit rights is, some of the challenges that clients have had with performing audits is that in a pandemic, where you've got travel restrictions and restrictions on having people on premises, a lot of enterprises that aren't essential can't even have people physically present. So this raises questions around how you'll actually go about enforcing audit rights and how you'll perform an audit, because it's one thing to have an express right to perform an audit and agreement, and another entirely to think about how you actually effectuate that right in a disruptive event like a pandemic. So one opportunity that the pandemic raises is looking at ways to use technology to address some of these issues, which for us is exciting. It really has put kind of an increased focus on technology to support audits, as well as kind of use of local experts and thinking about kind of creative ways to facilitate an audit where you've got the appropriate right in your agreement. As Sam mentioned, one of the real big drivers, in addition to just the contractual provisions, is thinking about adverse economic impact and cost and things that are really important from a commercial perspective. So one of the key drivers for us in doing this kind of thought exercise was thinking about how pandemics disrupt economic activity and how parties are able to be flexible in order to address issues. For instance, rethinking minimum commits and spend obligations under an agreement. The types of things that can provide flexibility for an agreement to continue in effect and for the parties to continue to engage in their relationship, kind of as opposed to agreements that may be more prescriptive of consequences, which is just to say, rather than allowing for flexibility in order to kind of conform and figure out a way to do business in this new environment, versus having agreements that really just have a termination right in the event of certain events or certain impacts. Governing law, another provision that doesn't get a whole lot of attention, except for with respect to certain bespoke types of issues where parties are sensitive to governing law. I think, again, coming back to force majeure, the selection of a governing law provision for a particular contract really does raise questions around how that would affect the force majeure clause. Choice of law really can have a profound effect on how a force majeure clause is interpreted. And so, it's a real shame to think about potentially going through an exercise of working through a force majeure clause that does provide certain protections, and then finding out that the particular governing law that you've chosen for your agreement doesn't really support the contractual kind of architecting that you've done with the provision. Import-export, another big one. How will the parties address rapid changes in import and export restrictions? We saw that in a very real way, where parties were really kind of making game time decisions with respect to quickly changing regulations related to import and export. Business continuity provisions, another really important kind of thought exercise that we've had. A lot of business continuity plans in traditional outsourcing, maybe where part of the supply chain includes call center support. And a lot of the security protections are based on the fact that those call center services were provided from physically secured locations. And now, of course, a lot of that work is being done from home. There is, of course, the potential that that was contemplated, but a business continuity plan is really for the short term, kind of to gap fill in the event of a disruptive interim event. And they're not generally thought to be kind of going forward, this is how business will work, this is how we'll run things. So thinking about how, security will be achieved and ensured where people are working from home and from less secure facilities for long periods of time, and trying to kind of understand how we'll put these protections in place and how we'll kind of execute is, sort of an extension of a business continuity plan. But for us, when we've, been home for however many months now, thinking about that in the long term is a bit of a different exercise. Kind of moves us in then to supplier onboarding. Once we've kind of gone through that contractual consideration and are ready to onboard a supplier, thinking about creating a culture of preparedness, understanding and having some visibility into your supplier's preparedness plans, or if you are the supplier, thinking about what those look like. That kind of takes us back a step, thinking about if you are going to be a supplier, how are you going to present your own model of preparedness? Making sure that these are aligned between supplier and buyer, maybe even doing testing on their execution. A lot of, again, the call center example, I think, is a good one, thinking about trying to take a plan that is really architected for the short term and how you might realize that into a longer term scenario. With respect to corporate social responsibility, workplace protections, understanding how your suppliers are protecting their employees and their workers, thinking about, are there appropriate protections in place from a shielding, distancing perspective in terms of the current pandemic. Even if you're engaging a third party to provide a product or service, there are important considerations here in thinking about how a supplier, if you are the supplier, how you're protecting your workforce. Remote onboarding, again, kind of in connection with the audit rights discussion, you can have a kind of perfectly crafted plan with respect to onboarding, but trying to make sure that you've got the ability to roll that out when you and your supplier will be trying to implement virtually. I think part of a lot of discussions that we're having, not even just related to contracting, but thinking about how do we make sure that we kind of maintain our corporate culture and that our contracting parties understand what that looks like on both sides. Is really important. It's challenging, and I think it also provides an opportunity for a bit of creativity. We think that kind of with respect to this particular issue, it's something that clients really might want to have a look at from a litigation risk perspective, thinking about if you're the buyer and I'm an employee who's been working in an environment where my health and safety hasn't been protected, if I'm dedicated to a particular customer and that particular customer has then kind of potentially exposed their counterparty to some liability due to kind of lack of protections, if there are health risks that are associated, is something that we anticipate litigation groups will look at as this kind of pandemic rolls forward.
Great.
Which brings us to, next topic, supplier performance management. And Sam, I'll pass back to you.
Terrific, Amy. Thank you so much for that. I thought that was a really great run through of a number of significant issues. One of the ones that I would just, like to mention a little bit, which is an implication of some of the things that Amy said, is that in thinking about, particularly from a supplier perspective, but also from the customer perspective as well, is not just the near-term impacts with respect to the pandemic. We were talking about working from home issues and how maybe that's addressed in a business continuity plan, which is meant for the short term, but even when it becomes a longer term event, it's not just with respect to for however long the pandemic may last, because it may be that we're seeing changes introduced by the pandemic that become long lasting in the new normal. There may be many suppliers and even some customers that are no longer maintaining the large facilities, separate facilities, to provide services, and work from home can really become the new way in which suppliers perform. So thinking in the long term about from the supplier and the customer perspective about how business is going to be done in the future, given what's been experienced in the pandemic and the fact that we may see more of these types of disruptions, may change the nature of how services of this type are provided in the future. So something again that sourcing managers will want to think about. Looking at the issue here on this slide with respect to supplier performance management, the one word that we kind of come back to again and again is that parties need to be agile in their approach to these issues, particularly when it's unclear what the impact is going to be. What we're trying to express is that in supply chain contracts, when there's a disruption of this kind, if you have very prescriptive terms, as Amy had indicated, like service level commitments that can punish a supplier from not meeting a performance objective that doesn't take into consideration the impact of a pandemic on the performance, or may provide undue weight to punishment, when really what you want to do is ensure that the supplier continues to supply and stays in business. It's important to kind of rethink some of the traditional types of discussions and negotiations that happen between customers and suppliers, so they can really understand how to be able to create sustainable supply chains and make sure that they're being worked on from the perspective of creating longer term relationships. Amy had mentioned audit rights, and those are very similar to digital performance reviews. How are we going to execute and manage those types of performance reviews and ensure that the supplier's delivery meets quality control requirements? This may be an opportunity for technology to play an important role, like we see in the Internet of Things, maybe using sensors, may be able to help quality control management by being able to extract information without having to do on-site inspections and reviews. So the takeaway is to make sure that supplier performance management, that function is agile and provides enough flexibility to be able to address disruptions and really create longer term value propositions between suppliers and customers. You can go to the next slide. Thanks. So risk management. Risk management, as we'd indicated, is a topic that kind of flows through our entire discussion in terms of reappraising our supply chain and kind of inoculating it against the effects of the pandemic. And so how do we manage those particular risks? Again, technology may be able to provide us with some assistance here, using predictive analytics to anticipate supply chain disruptions and risks and take actions based on those analytics, being able to use the kind of plethora of data that's being created in order to make strategic decisions before their impacts are already felt. Maybe there'll be a trade-off here. So for example, your business may have been set up to use just-in-time inventory but that may have to change, and it may make sense to hold a bit more product or component in inventory, given that there could be potential risks, disruptions, and barriers to international trade due to a pandemic. So what the pandemic really demonstrates is that the supply chain itself can generate real value for an enterprise by thinking about these risks and managing them in a proactive way that takes these types of unanticipated disruptions into consideration. Next slide. Relationship management, a lot of this goes to governance. And how do you govern a relationship where you can't be physically present? There are great tools that are available, but we'll keep learning more, and this is going to be an evolving area. It's too early to be thinking about virtual management and how do we make that authentic and real to develop a relationship so that can be an agile relationship virtually. But being able to leverage tech and data to be able to do that, I think, is where more well-managed supply chains are going to move in order to be able to have governance happening at the virtual level. Next slide. And then kind of finally, the last part of looking at the supply chain life cycle is supply chain offboarding. That's really the final step and takes us back again to the top of the wheel, thinking about what are the right termination rights in light of a pandemic and what sort of termination assistance there should be and how it can be provided. How do you do things like knowledge transfer through non-traditional methods where the incumbent supplier and the successor supplier can't be in the same room? If you do have to terminate in light of the pandemic, either because you've got a supplier that has limited supply and they can't meet your requirements or minimum supply requirements under an agreement, or you're just concerned with their ability to fully perform, and where in particular the failure to not fully perform might be excused due to a force majeure clause or the operation of the force majeure doctrine, you do need to look at the consequences of termination under your agreements in certain jurisdictions. Whether, for example, you may owe money to a particular supply chain partner, for instance, a downstream distributor or dealer in a jurisdiction that still has dealer protection legislation. Or you may have decided to part ways with a supply chain partner because they've had a financial issue, or the nature of your business may have changed. You may still need to go through that particular analysis to determine whether there's a cost impact. And a lot of these are statutory obligations that aren't necessarily going to be sensitive to the impact of the pandemic. So kind of addressing these types of issues and looking now at what are your termination terms in the agreement, what are the consequences of termination, what does a terminated supplier have to provide you at a time when you may be most vulnerable? Are these really resilient to external issues like a pandemic? And in particular, termination assistance and knowledge transfer to the extent that they're impaired or prevented due to the pandemic and may be excused under a force majeure clause. It's important to look at those particular issues now in order to make sure that your supply chain remains resilient and as best as possible has mitigated the negative impacts of unanticipated activities and events like a pandemic. So I think that really takes us, Amy, to the end of our presentation in terms of going through the life cycle of a supply chain and the types of issues that at least we've determined are appropriate to take a look at and reevaluate in light of unanticipated global events such as the pandemic. We hope that these issues have been interesting to you, that they provoke some conversation, that these may be steps that you're already taking. There may be steps that you're taking that are more sophisticated than the ones that we've presented to you today. But we hope that this will be an ongoing conversation and that supply chain managers, working both for suppliers and for customers, are starting to have these conversations and coming up with the strategies to be able to be more resilient and withstand the pandemic as well as future events that are currently unanticipated that may impact the supply chain. So with our thanks, my thanks to Amy and our thanks to the IAOP, we're happy to turn it back now either to Debbie or Amanda and see if perhaps there were any questions that you had during our presentation that we may be able to spend a few minutes answering.
Great. Thanks so much, Sam and Amy. This was a really fantastic session. We haven't had any questions come in yet, but those who are on the call, if you have any questions, please feel free, drop them in the Q&A box while we have these experts here to answer your questions. So we'll just give it a few seconds, see if any pop in, and then otherwise we can wrap for the day. Well, oh, here we go. We've got one here. Are you seeing a trend to move to T&M model?
I guess the question was moving towards a time and materials model as opposed to fixed fee with respect to the provision of services. That's kind of my assumption as to what the question that's being asked was. Not seeing anything in particular that's driving a movement in that particular area. The one impact that we are seeing is a movement away from the types of requirements and contracts around needs-based, requirements-based contracts, significant minimum purchases. While we understand that those protect parties and the economic bargain that they've reached, we see both suppliers and customers being a little bit more sanguine about that particular issue and understanding that there can be disruptions, particularly because all of our clients sit as both customers and suppliers. So we are seeing some clients come back to us and move away from those types of requirements or minimum supply, but not so much a move from fixed to time and materials. Haven't seen that yet, but we'll definitely keep an eye out for it.
Okay, great. That is so far the only question that has come in. Just means you guys were so excellent at answering all the questions during your presentation.
I did see one that came in on the chat that came to me. I think maybe it's to all panelists. And the question was, are there any other supply chain disruptions that you foresee that are not pandemics? And great question. I don't know if I really have a good crystal ball in terms of foreseeing those types of supply chain interruptions, but one of the things that we were seeing kind of immediately pre-pandemic was a move away from globalization at the political level, where we saw tariffs and trade wars being more of an issue over the past 4 years or so. And those do have significant impacts on supply chain and managed services in terms of the economic impact to the overall sourcing relationship. It may be the case that those continue as there's been kind of a global move away from globalization, but it's unclear yet. Given that we've got an election coming up shortly, it's really unclear what the political climate, at least in the US, is going to be. But that's one of the things that we started to look at pre-pandemic was the impact of trade barriers, rising trade barriers on the supply chain. And that led a lot of our clients to consider second sourcing and near sourcing options, nearshore sourcing options in order to have a strategy to deal with those types of things that, whether they're anticipated or unanticipated, would be outside of the control of the parties to the supply chain.
Great. We had one more question come in. Any trends you're seeing in terms of supply chain disruptions related to China?
Trends related to China, interesting. So we've seen various things happen over time. Over the past couple of years, one of the things that we noted was an increasing hostility in China to the use of staffing companies. And so one of the issues had to do with doing sourcing, and particularly this is in the managed sourcing space when you're talking about people. And the impact on whether you needed to have local presences in particular countries in order to provide feet on the street, boots on the ground, whatever phrase you want to use, in order to provide services. With respect to kind of the political climate currently past, couple of years, with respect to China, what we've seen is really anecdotal, which is an increasing wariness about sole sourcing to China, because there were a lot of supply either from suppliers or critical providers to suppliers that were coming out of China, both in terms of their ability to meet capacity requirements and from a cost perspective, that it became a concern for a number of our clients. And that's when they started to look at, architecting their supply chains differently so that they had options that did not go through China. I think that's a trend that started before the pandemic. I think that's something that's going to happen after the pandemic as well. And there's a kind of convergence of reasons behind that. It's not only political and trade issues that are involved there, but environmental issues as well. There's a big push for a number of large companies, large retailers, where our supplier base tends to all be suppliers to those particular clients, where there are kind of high level requirements for zero waste in the supply chain. And given the tremendous environmental impact of having components and goods cross oceans, there's been looking at kind of more nearshore sourcing and doing more of the sourcing domestically, even looking within the United States at reducing travel footprint and the movement of goods. So I think that's something that we're going to see impacting China the most, but impacting a lot of other kind of go-to destinations as sourcing providers.
Fantastic. I don't see anything else in the chat or in the Q&A.
Well, as I mentioned, we're happy to answer questions afterwards if people are thinking about it. Hopefully that means you're looking at the slides, you're talking about it. If questions do come up, you'll have copies of the slides that have our email address. I really do encourage you to send us questions. We'd love to keep the dialogue going. We get smarter when we hear from you, and our presentations get better. So we look forward to continuing the conversation with anyone who wants to reach out to us.
Great, fantastic. We will be sharing, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, we'll be sharing the recording along with the slide deck. You should receive all of that tomorrow. Thank you again to Sam and Amy for your time, the entire Baker McKenzie team, and everybody have a great day.